Diamond Equity Research Emerging Growth Invitational. Our first presenting company is VolitionRx, and our speaker is Scott Powell, the EVP of Investor Relations. Scott, I'll turn over you to present.
Thanks, Hunter, and it's a pleasure to be here this morning for the Diamond Research Conference. Appreciate the opportunity to present the story. And thank you everyone for dialing in for the VolitionRx presentation. I'm Scott Powell. I'm the Head of Investor Relations for VolitionRx, and I'm the Chief Financial Officer of Volition America. Thank you everyone this morning for joining this presentation. I'd like to point you to our obligatory disclaimer slide. I will be making some forward-looking statements this morning, which may or may not be realized, so I do point you to the disclaimer. Onto this slide, a little bit about Volition. Our mission is simple. We want to save lives. What do we mean by that? VolitionRx is a diagnostics company. We are developing a series of blood tests to screen for cancer and other diseases. And if we look at the cancer space currently, there really are very few blood tests that are commonly utilized as frontline screens for any cancer. But the only commonly administered blood test to screen for any cancer type is the PSA test, which screens for prostate cancer in men. We do take blood tests to screen for instance, cholesterol, triglycerides, glucose, hepatitis, HIV, various bodily functions, but really very few blood tests to screen for cancers. Cancers are typically screened through X-rays, so mammography, CAT scan, are screened through biopsies, so taking a tissue sample from a particular organ, colonoscopy or fecal test, for instance, for colorectal cancer screening. These tests that we currently utilize, they suffer from a series of limitations. So the ones I just mentioned, so if we take scans, X-rays, CAT scans, MRIs, for instance, those are expensive diagnostic tests. They potentially expose the patient to risk because there's radiation exposure. Many of these tests can be invasive, so think a colonoscopy, think a lung biopsy. These are not without risk, right? They're surgical procedures in many cases. They're invasive procedures. They can cause infection. With a lung biopsy, a collapsed lung occurs about 15% of the time. Many of these screens, therefore, are, as I mentioned, very expensive. They can be invasive. Many of them are much better at late stage detection than early stage. And obviously, that's the inverse of where you want to be when it comes to cancer detection. Early detection for most cancers is the key to improved outcomes and survivability. And so if your tests are really only picking up people with later stage cancer, they're not that useful. Blood is a preferred modality. It has a lot of advantages. So screening for cancers through a blood test doesn't expose the patient to any risk because you're simply analyzing blood that's been taken from them already. There's no invasive process. Our technology is simple, runs on standard laboratory ELISA equipment. Therefore, you don't need complicated or special equipment to analyze our blood test. Our cost of goods is low, and blood is a preferred modality. So we would improve compliance rates, right? Because a person who is averse to a colonoscopy, for instance, or a lung biopsy, and so they delay, they don't do it, or they don't do it as soon as they should because they're not comfortable with the risk or don't understand some of the risks. Those same individuals probably would not hesitate to do a simple blood test if there were one available to them. So what that means is we would drive compliance rates up. Therefore, we would get more people screened because blood is a preferred and largely accepted modality versus those people who are delaying, or refusing to do X-rays, scans, biopsies, colonoscopies, and so forth. So that's one of our key advantages, is that we are working in blood, and it's clearly a preferred modality. I'll move to what is probably of most interest to the listeners today, and that's the first blood test, our first product that we launched at the end of November of last year, and that is in animal health. So I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit to our Nu-Q vet cancer screening test. And this is a blood test that we launched at the end of November last year in collaboration with Texas A&M University in College Station, Texas. And in October of 2019, we formed our wholly owned subsidiary, Volition Veterinary Diagnostics Development, LLC. And at that time, we granted Texas A&M University a 12.5% equity ownership stake in our wholly owned subsidiary. In return, Texas A&M over the course of 2019 and 2020 organized and ran several clinical studies in canines looking at the efficacy of our blood test in detecting a number of canine cancers. And we announced results last year. Results were very strong for two very common canine cancers. And Texas A&M and Volition felt that the results were strong enough to warrant a product launch, which we did at the end of November. So looking a little bit at, why don't we look a little bit at the data first? And you can see from this slide, our blood test for canines with high accuracy identifies two common canine cancers, canine lymphoma on the left and angiosarcoma on the right. And you can see our clinical data. Our area under the curve for canine lymphoma was 87.3%. That's your overall accuracy. So that includes your false negative rate and your false positive rates, right? So there are two primary measures of accuracy for a test. How is your false negative rate and your false positive rate? So if you look at 74% sensitivity at 100% specificity, sensitivity is your false negative rate. So at 74% sensitivity, we accurately identified through our simple blood tests about 3/4 of canines that did have canine lymphoma. 100% specificity is your false positive rate. You subtract these numbers from 100. So 100 minus 74% gives you a 26% false negative rate. So we missed about 1/4 of canines with lymphoma, but 100% specificity subtracted from 100 gives you 0% false positives. So we had absolutely no false positives in the study. So with no false positives, that is no canines going on for additional confirmatory diagnostic workups for canine lymphoma that did not have canine lymphoma. And you can trade one for the other. So if you can see on the chart here, you can increase your sensitivity, which will typically decrease your specificity and vice versa. So depending on what's most important, false negative rate or false positive rate to the end user, you can move your false negative and false positive rate around a little bit by moving your cutoff point. So really good results in canine lymphoma. Even more spectacular results in hemangiosarcoma. You can see that at 100% specificity, so again, no false positives, we accurately detected almost 90% of all canines with hemangiosarcoma. These are two very common canine cancers. They account for about 1/3 of all canine cancers. So we're off to a really excellent start. So the way that our blood test would be used in practice, and I'll go back to here, the way it would be used in practice. So certain breeds of canines are predisposed to certain cancer types. So for instance, if you're a German Shepherd, let's say German Shepherds, for instance, let's say that 95, 98% of German Shepherds, when they get cancer, it tends to be hemangiosarcoma. And that's the same. Certain breeds are very much predisposed to certain cancer types. So our blood test can be used initially for symptomatic screening, right? So the vets tell us that the challenge that they have is differentiating between cancer, infection, and inflammation in canines. And so when a dog comes into the vet's office that's sick, presenting with symptoms, the vets often have a hard time forming a confirmatory diagnosis and really figuring out what's wrong with the canine, unless they do a whole series of workup diagnostic tests, so run a series of scans or biopsies. Oftentimes the veterinarians are reluctant to order a battery of diagnostic tests on the first visit. And oftentimes they try and do some simple diagnostic tests to try and figure out what might be causing these symptoms, and then send you and your dog home with, often some pills to put into the dog food. Unfortunately, a lot of times they don't have a definitive diagnosis, and so a lot of times the therapy or the treatment they're giving your dog is not the right one, and so oftentimes it's not addressing the underlying causal factors of these symptoms, and therefore the canine is not getting any better. So you may end up bringing your dog back in 2 weeks or a month's time back to the vet, and at that point they may run additional diagnostic tests. At that point, if a month, 2 months, several months have gone by, the risk is that the cancer is progressing from an earlier stage to a later stage cancer, and that makes it more difficult to treat. And the risk that the cancer is metastasizing and potentially spreading to other organs within your canine. So this would be quite useful for symptomatic screening. So your dog presents with symptoms over the past couple of weeks, you take your dog into the veterinarian office, and the vet can immediately order a volition blood test, and I think within about 3 days get results from that blood test, and that can rule in or rule out cancer if your canine is a breed that's predisposed to either canine lymphoma and or hemangiosarcoma. And that, as I said, that accounts for about a third of all canine, those account for about a third of all canine cancers. You can see some of the statistics here on the left. 38% of all households have a canine. There's about 77 million canines in the US and about 20 million that are age 7 or older. You can see that 83% of canines visit a vet at least once a year, and 3/4 of those visits are for routine care. So our blood test will have significant utility for symptomatic screening. You can see here in the two bubbles, 6 million canines are diagnosed with cancer in the US each year. So a significant number of canines that are diagnosed with cancer. Remember, the number of canines actually suffering from cancer each year is much larger than the 6 million, because many canines go undiagnosed. Many canines pass away from cancer without having a definitive diagnosis, right? If your canine unexpectedly passes away, you're not going to have an autopsy performed to find out the cause of death, right? So the 6 million number dramatically underreports, in all likelihood, the number of cancers each year. So it's a very large market for us for symptomatic screening. In addition, because there are 6 million cancer diagnoses, and there are many more canines than the 6 million that are suffering and have symptoms each year. So a very significant market for us. In addition, there's an opportunity for us to capture some of the asymptomatic market. So as you can see here on the left, 7 million, there are 20 million canines age 7 or older. That's an important number for canines. When a canine turns age 7, they're much more likely to develop cancer than under age 7. So our test could, again, be implemented for asymptomatic screening when your healthy canine turns age 7. If it's a breed that's predisposed to one of these two cancer types, could be a candidate for a volition blood test to test your canine at age 7, 8, age 9, age 10, et cetera, to see if they have developed one of these two cancer types. So it would be a tool for early detection, would be able to identify the cancer, ideally at an earlier stage, treat your canine much sooner, because most canines unfortunately get treated for cancer after they're exhibiting symptoms. And just like with humans, once you're symptomatic, and if the underlying causal factors are from a cancer type, it tends to be later stage, and obviously your outcomes are not as good as if we were able to detect it at an earlier stage. So a little bit on the numbers. As you can see at the bottom, we sell the blood test to Texas A&M for $45. Texas A&M sells it to vets at $122, and then vets resell it to the general public, to canine owners, for anywhere from $160 to $200 is the suggested retail price. So you can do the math. With 77 million canines in the US, many of them with symptoms, many of them asymptomatic, but age 7 or older. Do the math. If we sell 100,000 tests a year, it's 4.5 million in revenue to Volition. If we sell 1 million tests a year, it's 45 million in revenue to Volition with a very high gross profit margin. So really excited as we continue to roll out this product through Texas A&M University's sales efforts. We have also announced publicly that we will be interested in signing a licensing deal with one of the large animal health companies in the US to really saturate the US market with our blood test and potentially penetrate the international market. So as we've mentioned publicly, we are interested in having those discussions. So we're really excited about the opportunity here in animal health. As many of you know, lymphoma is a blood-borne cancer. While we were looking at lymphoma in canines, we decided to perform some research on humans as well. And moving here to blood cancer in humans, you can see there's a large opportunity here as well for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, acute myeloid leukemia, and ALL, about 700,000 cases globally. The issue with screening for these blood-borne cancers in humans is that the symptoms that people present with are often non-specific and are often confused for other less severe underlying causal factors. So a blood test that can be run, particularly one that's easy to use and inexpensive like Volition's, when a person presents with these non-specific symptoms, to rule in or rule out a number of these blood-borne cancers would be very, very useful. And as you can see here, we have some initial data. You can see our AUCs and sensitivity and specificity. We're getting good results, in the 60 to 80% range for our AUCs and for our sensitivity and specificity. So getting good results in smaller studies. We have announced publicly that we would like to launch a large study in blood-borne cancers in humans in the United States, and we're moving forward to doing that and hope to have some additional announcements over the course of 2021 as we move forward with clinical studies looking at blood-borne cancers. And given that we're down to just a few minutes before the Q&A, I will just touch upon a couple other programs that we're working on in human health. Many of you know us as a company developing a blood test for colorectal cancer. That remains a major focus for the company, as well as we announced some data from our lung cancer study in Taiwan at National Taiwan University. I'll briefly touch upon these two programs. We expect to have additional data from our colorectal study at National Taiwan University in Taipei, as well as our lung cancer studies at National Taiwan University in Taipei over the course of 2021. Colorectal cancer is a challenging cancer to screen for, not because we lack a good screen. We actually have a very accurate screen in the colonoscopy, but it's a problem of compliance. People don't look forward to the colonoscopy procedure. So compliance rates in the US are around 62%. Compliance rates in Europe are around 50%. So about 38% of Americans are not getting screened for colorectal cancer. About half of Europeans are not current with their screening obligations for colorectal cancer, primarily because people don't like the modalities or options available to them, and so they simply don't get screened for this common cancer type. Compliance issues, the lack of compliance with screening obligations has led colorectal cancer to become the second leading cause of cancer-related death in the United States, and in most countries. In fact, it's the second or third leading cause. Lung cancer tends to be the deadliest cancer type in virtually every country globally. Colorectal cancer may surprise many of you to know that it's the second leading cause in many countries. 50,000 Americans die annually from colorectal cancer. It shouldn't be the number 2 cancer killer. It's largely because of compliance issues. People don't like the colonoscopy or fecal test, so they don't do it. And unfortunately, they turn age 50, 60, 70 without ever having been screened for colorectal cancer. Prevalence rates are around 0.3% in the US, so about 30 in 10,000 Americans of screening age will develop colorectal cancer statistically. Unfortunately, for many of them, they will become symptomatic first, finally go for a colonoscopy after presenting with symptoms. And if the symptoms are being caused by colorectal cancer, it's invariably stage 3 or stage 4, and your outcomes are not good. If colorectal cancer is diagnosed in stage 1, you have over a 90% chance of living more than 5 years. If you're diagnosed with stage 4 colorectal cancer, it's the opposite. You have a 93% chance of dying in the next 5 years. Early detection is the key for colorectal cancer. Modality is the problem. Our blood test ideally will solve this compliance problem, because while a person may refuse a colonoscopy, they probably wouldn't refuse a simple blood test if there were one available to them that's easily accessible, cost effective, and accurate. So really excited to move the colorectal cancer program forward as well. And then I'll just touch upon lung cancer and then open it up to questions. With lung cancer, the challenge is doctors deciding whether or not to send a patient on for a confirmatory lung biopsy. As I mentioned earlier, about 15% of the time, a lung biopsy causes a collapsed lung. So if the doctors had an additional tool to use, what they typically use is a CAT scan, an image of your lungs, to see if there's any suspicious nodules or lesions on the CAT scan. And if there are, and they think they're malignant, they will often send you on for a lung biopsy. But there's a significant risk of a lung biopsy. If the doctors could run a volition blood test as well, because they suspect something on the CAT scan is suspicious, they would have two pieces of information. And if they see something suspicious on the CAT scan, the volition blood test comes back positive, they're much more likely to send the patient on for a lung biopsy. And vice versa, if the blood test comes back negative and they weren't certain about the image, they will hold off on that lung biopsy. So it's a lot more information that will be provided to physicians, and a much better informed decision about whether a patient should go on for that lung biopsy or not. So really excited about our program there as well. And then, sorry for skipping so fast, but I'll just point you to our financials and then open it up for questions. You can see here, we're listed on the NYSE American Stock Exchange, ticker VNRX. Market cap has been hovering more around the $250 million range for the past couple months. We just raised $20 million 2 weeks ago with Cantor Fitzgerald in a bought deal offering at $5.25 a share. So we have a very comfortable cash position. The cash on hand of $21 million does not include the $20 million that we recently raised. So we have well over 2 years worth of cash. So we're in a very comfortable position. We have 5 analysts covering the company, strong institutional ownership, about 20% institutionally held, including some large index funds. And I think we're well positioned for some really interesting clinical data in our bloodborne cancers, lung cancer, colorectal cancer programs, as well as announcing revenue data and growth data for our animal health blood test for canines. So really excited about 2021 and beyond. Thank you all very much for dialing in today for our presentation. You can see our website here. Please don't hesitate to contact me if you have any further questions on Volition, and hopefully you'll all follow our news flow and story over the course of 2021 and beyond. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Scott. Appreciate the presentation. So we had one question. The NQ Vet investor wanted to know what's the how many units have been sold and what are the sales to date on that?
Everyone is asking. So great question. We haven't announced any sales data yet. Really, it's very early in the process. We launched at the end of November, so we've really only had 2 months of sales data, right? December and January, 2 full months. So it's really, even if we release the data now, it's not really indicative of what we think are future sales. So it's not, you know, what I guess what I'm saying is that we haven't announced the data. We will announce on our annual earnings call for 2020, of course. And then to the extent we have guidance, you know, we'll try to give some guidance, but we haven't announced the revenue figures. We typically don't give guidance. You can see the market is very large, 77 million canines in the US, and our test could be used for symptomatic screening, 6 million canines with cancer each year, and asymptomatic, 20 million canines over age 7. And we have the opportunity to sell through Texas A&M. Also, as I mentioned, we are hopeful to sign a licensing deal with one or more large animal health companies. So the sales figures could change dramatically, and there could be significant growth opportunity for us, but we'll provide more color on our earnings call.
Okay, great. And then quickly, just on the balance sheet, we recently raised a significant amount of capital with Cantor. Just, you know, what does that take you to in terms of near-term inflection points?
Yeah, so we finished the end of Q3 last year with about 21 million in cash. We received $4 million equivalent in grants and loans from the Belgian regional government, and then we raised 20 million with Cantor. So you can kind of do the math. We're burning about 1.7 million per month. So you can kind of do the math. And we also have an ATM with Cantor, a $25 million ATM with Cantor Fitzgerald and Oppenheimer. So we're in a very comfortable cash position. If we didn't raise any money with the ATM, and if we didn't get any additional grants or loans, we've got around 2 years worth of cash. If we're able to tap the ATM, and we should be able to, because the trading volume in our stock has increased substantially over the past few months, we'll look to opportunistically utilize the ATM on days when the stock is performing very well. We have a lot of data coming over the course of 2021, both from vet sales as well as clinical data. So we're in a very comfortable position cash-wise, and I think investors can be confident that our balance sheet is very strong and just focused on sales data and clinical data.
Great, perfect. So I think we're out of time for the presentation, but very much appreciate you presenting at the Diamond Equity Conference. And anyone that has further questions, they can reach out to Diamond Equity and we'll connect you to Scott Powell at VolitionRx. Again, Scott, thanks for presenting and attending our event.
Thank you, Hunter, for having me. It was a pleasure. And everyone enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you all for dialing in.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you. Thanks, Hunter.